Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Hormonally Speaking. So glad to have you here as always. This week we're doing a little something different, though in my opinion it's not really off topic in any form or fashion. If you've been around here for a while, or you've been a part of any of my programs, you know how important working through things like trauma and other stuff that we have dealt with in our childhood and in our teenage years and adulthood, in terms of how that really impacts our hormones in such a big way. You can't get away from these systems and these emotional aspects that are going to really make a big difference when it comes to your hormone world. A lot of us, want the sort of diet to eat and the supplements to take and how to move our bodies. But just as important is this sort of emotional component and working through what we're going to talk about today, which is just a fascinating thing. For me, I just actually learned about attachment theory probably just a few years ago. And today we actually have an expert on attachment theory here with us. Her name is Elizabeth Gillette, and she is an LCSW, and she's an attachment specialist. In her therapy and coaching practices, she supports her clients in developing secure ways of relating and improving their relationships by breaking old patterns and establishing healthy connections with integrity. Elizabeth is the author of Attachment Theory Workbook for Couples, which we're definitely going to talk about today, a resource that offers a framework for understanding attachment theory and interactive exercises and tools individuals and couples can utilize to create expansive, spacious, and connected relationships. You can find her at her website, elizabethgillette.com. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm so happy to be here with you. This is really an exciting topic to talk about.
Yes, it so is. And like I said, I just really learned probably a few years ago about attachment theory. And this is something that I feel like we all should know and understand more about. And I'm sure you feel the same way. So let's just start there. What is attachment theory? And yeah, how do people sort of find themselves with different attachment styles?
So attachment theory is really, it's a framework for attempting to understand how our early relationships impact our adult relationships. And by early relationships, we're talking about, yes, our relationships with our caregivers for sure, but also our, elementary age relationships and our teenage relationships and maybe relationships in our early 20s. They all shape how we feel about ourselves and how we feel in the world. And when we're looking at, some of the early research on attachment theory, it really is rooted in those like very early relationships, but we recognize that it's a thread, just like anything else. And so in attachment theory, there are 4 basic attachment styles. Secure is the attachment style that we're all working towards. And even those of us who find ourselves in a mostly kind of secure place, there's always things that we can do to feel more settled and more confident in our relationships. And people who have the secure style, they're looking at the world and they feel safe. They feel like they belong. They feel like they're welcomed. They feel that way in their relationships too, right? They're able to bring in this sense of flexibility, this sense of sort of like calm and peace, even if there are moments of disconnection or, arguments or, things like that, that always arise in any relationship. And people who have the avoidant style, which is the next most common, people who have that style are more likely to feel like they need a lot of space in relationships. They feel like they process things more effectively when they're on their own versus when they're kind of processing in relationships. And a lot of that happens because in their early childhood experiences, they may have been related to in ways that were sort of emotionally unavailable, or maybe a little bit harsh, or maybe we're even focused on achievement instead of just being the person that you are in the world. And so for those reasons, in adulthood, relationships can feel kind of overwhelming sometimes for them. It can feel a little bit too vulnerable. It can feel like too much. And so you might see them shutting down, pulling away. And I really just try to emphasize with that attachment style that people who have that come by it honestly. Right? It's something that results from childhood experiences that were particularly challenging. So I always like to name that. And then the anxious attachment style, which I find in lots of folks who come to my therapy and coaching practices, is basically where your nervous system is activated a lot of the time. So you might find yourself, the early stages of a relationship can feel super overwhelming, super activating, where you're finding yourself like your stomach might feel upset, or you find yourself having obsessive thinking about the person or checking your phone a lot and those types of things. And a lot of that comes from really kind of inconsistent interactions in childhood. And again, this is not, I always say this when I talk about attachment theory, this is not blame or shame on our caregivers or our parents, right? Like everyone was doing their best. And we also recognize that if we have that inconsistency in our childhoods, we're always looking for these cues outside of ourselves to determine whether or not we're okay, whether we're safe, whether this relationship is stable. And we're always just looking for that sense of security and stability. And then the last attachment style is disorganized. And that style is kind of a mix of anxious and avoidant.
Okay.
And really the idea here is that for people with that style, oftentimes they had childhood experiences that may have been neglectful or very scary. There might have been violence in their family. There may have been substance use. They were in a position where basically their survival system and their attachment system were really kind of fighting against each other. It was like this idea where we really want to connect with people who we love and who we care about, but they might also be pretty scary to us. And so you kind of see that's where that disorganized idea comes in. It's like there's not a consistent way of relating. Sometimes we feel like we can approach, but then sometimes we have to avoid because the situation doesn't feel safe. So that's like the very superficial explanation of those styles. And there are definitely, you can take lots of attachment quizzes online. There's all kinds of information out there. And I just really encourage people when you're Googling, be very mindful of where the information is coming from, because there are some styles that are kind of discriminated against, I guess, is what I'll say, is that it's there are some styles where people say, especially the avoidant style, like don't date people with the avoidant style. And it's just like, well, we all have kind of a slice of the pie for all of it.
That's what I was going to ask, because, as you were talking through, I was like, oh yeah, avoidant. And then I was like, oh yeah, anxious, and I was like, but I'm not sure like that I'm like full on. Yeah. So people kind of like ricochet throughout depending on the situation, that kind of thing.
Definitely. Yes. And I mean, it's very, very clear to us now that our attachment styles show up in many different ways and in different relationships, right? So in my relationship with you, for example, I might be feeling a particular attachment style. And then in a relationship with another friend, I might be feeling something else. So we kind of have these early blueprints from our caregivers or our family members. And anytime we meet somebody who reminds us of those blueprints, we can shift into that style.
That makes sense.
The other thing I'll say too is that with the attachment styles, there's a style called earn secure.
Oh my goodness.
Which is like, it's another, and basically what that is it's demonstrating how we can heal from any of these experiences that we've had and become more secure and really show up that way in our relationships.
I remember reading at some point that like 50% of people are secure, and I was like, securely attached, and I was like, really?
It's an interesting figure, isn't it? It's it's interesting to consider that, because I think for sure, right, we all have some of that secure style,
right,
and we can all probably develop more.
Right. I mean, because when you think about it, I feel like no matter how perfect the parent, right, there usually is some kind of issue. Either they're like too sort of like, I don't want to say taking too much care of their child, but maybe like too much overseeing everything, or, obviously the other side is like being too pulled away. But like, I mean, just being human is to mess up, right? And like parents can't be perfect. And so I feel like that, I remember when I heard that about the secure attachment, I was like, how is that even possible? Just being human, to be like that idea of I am securely attached all the time. Like I was like, I don't know if I'm buying that.
That's right. And I don't know that I do either, right? Doing this work, I don't know that there's anyone who's securely attached all the time.
Right.
And I think that it is just important for us to recognize what brings up some of that nervous system activation, and what is it that happens in our relationships. And that's an opportunity for us to do a lot of observation of ourselves, of our interactions, and focus on feeling as confident and calm as we can while still being engaged in the relationship.
Right, right. So I know this is a little left field, but as you were talking, I also was wondering, is there any connection with sort of introversion versus extroversion with the different styles?
Yes. So it's such an interesting question because I've thought about this as far as introversion, extroversion, high sensitivity, right? Like there's so many different things that can be at play here. And I do think that with the introversion and extroversion, something that you were kind of talking about, which is parental involvement or caregiver involvement. If a child is somebody who really needs a lot of alone time and a caregiver is not attuned to that and doesn't recognize that that's what they need, if they consistently feel like their boundaries are intruded upon, they're probably going to develop one of the more, what we call insecure attachment styles, because so much of attachment is based on attunement, right? Our ability to see and recognize another person's emotional state and identify how we can show up in a way that feels supportive and is in alignment with what they're needing, right? And what we're needing. That's what attunement is. And so if a caregiver doesn't realize, like, my child's really introverted and they need a lot of space, they're probably going to feel intruded upon a lot. And that's going to impact how they feel about themselves in the world, how safe they feel, right? And whether they feel like their parent actually sees who they are and what they need. It's a great question.
So fascinating, because all the different like tendrils that can come into that, right? And thinking about parenting, a 2-year-old where you don't even fully know what the personality is like yet. And so figuring out what their needs are. Yeah. And this is why I'm just like, I think we all have something to work with, right, as adults, because there's just no way to perfection. So before we continue talking about this amazing work, how did you find yourself doing this work?
Yeah. So I, like most things, I came across it in a personal way. And so I was finding in my relationships that I was feeling so anxious all the time. And, some people talk about relationships, especially the beginning stages of relationships, feeling so blissful and so exciting.
Yeah.
I was like,
I'm like, no,
I don't understand who these people are or what they're talking about, because it is like torture.
Yeah. You're like, what's happening? What are they feeling? What am I feeling? Yeah.
Yes. What's going on? What are they, what are they thinking? Do they like me? Are they interested? Right. So much of I was recognizing I was just losing myself in these relationships. And, we can look back and I feel so much sadness for myself, for example, in college, being in relationships, thinking like, what was I thinking? And so, I was in my mid-20s. I was actually in the beginning stages of my relationship with my now partner of almost 11 years.
Oh, wow.
And so we were in this place, and I was just finding that I kept being activated and I could not figure out what it was that was going on. And so a friend gave me a copy of Hold Me Tight by Sue Johnson, which I highly recommend. And she talks in that book all about attachment theory. She talks about the cycles in attachment theory, which I hope we'll get to later in this conversation, and how we show up in these relationships and why. And I was I felt like my mind was just blown open at that point, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I was working with young children at that point. So looking, at attachment theory from a different lens, but really started to consider it in adults, and became interested in emotionally focused therapy, which is a modality for couples. And, really at that point, I was so into it and so recognizing how important it is for all of us to understand what our relational patterns are. I just couldn't get enough of it. So that's how I landed in that.
Nice. I love that. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely been a, whatever you call it, like just personal, introspection, like a rabbit hole for years and years of my life, from the Enneagram on, astrology, et cetera. And when attachment theory came up, it's like, this is really basic thing that we should know and understand about ourselves, right? Those patterns that we easily fall into, which sometimes I think with like, I mean, I love the Enneagram, but I think, people can sort of overuse that of like, well, I'm a 4, and it's like, oh, well, because I'm a 4, this is why I acted this way, versus like understanding, okay, so this is what happened, in my life to kind of get me to this place. And so how do I work with that differently and not like over identify and over attach.
Right. Exactly. In a different way, right? A different kind of attachment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I love that because it really is, it's so workable.
Yeah.
And some of these patterns are going to be more challenging to change. I'm not going to make it seem like it's easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but I feel like the commitment and the devotion to the practice of showing up and observing yourself and calming your nervous system, right? It's like all of these different pillars that we're working with so that we can start to see the shift and start to see the change. And so much of it is slowing down and understanding what it is that's happening and naming it out loud.
Right, right. So I definitely want to talk about how it impacts health here in a minute, but just kind of going off of what you were saying and what your book is about is working with couples on this area. And so can you kind of walk us through what a little bit of that would look like with a couple?
Yeah, for sure. So much of this, I think, in the beginning is understanding what attachment theory is and understanding what your attachment style tends to be, or at least in the relationship that you're wanting to work on, like recognizing that. And one of the most common relational patterns is called the anxious avoidant dynamic.
Okay.
And so you can imagine, right?
Yes.
One partner, the anxious partner, really pursuing, really wanting connection, really wanting a lot of closeness and physical affection, and an avoidant partner saying like, wow, this is overwhelming for me. It's too much. I need space. I need something else. It's too vulnerable. So shutting down, pulling away, right? And it's that sort of like run and chase kind of dynamic. And that is, it's so painful.
Yeah.
It's so painful to be in. And it's challenging to change. And so the workbook is really clear about understanding what these patterns are, right? And then helping people to understand what needs to happen in order to shift those dynamics. So a lot of it is bringing to the surface and bringing to the conversation emotions or feelings or experiences that may not have been verbalized before. So we kind of take for granted, I think, in some ways, where our partner is coming from or what they've been through, or even our own experiences, right? We're just sort of, we assume like, oh yeah, this thing happened to me, but oh, it's not a big deal.
Right.
Right. Or we do the thing kind of like you were talking about, which is over identifying sometimes and saying, oh, this thing happened to me and it defines who I am and how I am in relationships. And so we're really looking to create more of a balance in partnerships. And when we have a tool that we can use that helps us really slow down and get clear and have the support of, this like foundational support, I think that really helps us because so often in relationships, we're kind of winging it.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're out here, we're doing our best, we're trying, but we get hijacked emotionally or we fall into our old patterns and we just then keep repeating things. And that is not what we're wanting to do. We're not wanting to reinforce any of those old patterns if we don't have to. Right. So the book is really meant to be a guide to help us move into some, uncharted territory in our relationships so that we feel more confident and we feel like we have a structure that allows everyone in the relationship to feel safe.
So I was thinking, as you were talking about how, you mentioned before in the beginning of relationships where you feel all this anxiety when other people would feel bliss. And I can see, I mean, I know there's a whole different level of things that come the longer that you're in relationship. Obviously, all old kind of triggers can come up and stuff. But yeah, how would you recommend someone just getting into a relationship? Should they try and work with that, with their partner directly on that, or should they kind of be working more one-on-one with someone like you?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I think it can feel a little intimidating in an early relationship to say, let's work on our attachment pattern.
And the other person, the avoidant one is like, no.
I'm out, right? Like I am out. So do think there's space though to be having those types of conversations
Mm-hmm.
with people that we're in relationship with and say, hey, I've been working on this thing, or do you know anything about attachment theory? I'm
Right.
curious about what your style is, if you've heard of this. And, I think there's something about having conversations that can feel really helpful and just
Mm-hmm.
bringing that languaging into our
Mm-hmm.
relationship dynamics. And I do think that there's something so powerful about working on our relationship patterns when we're single,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or when we're in an early relationship, so that we're really clear about what it is that is happening for us.
Yeah.
And it may not feel like we have the relational stability yet to do that within the context of our
Mm-hmm.
relationships. And so that's where I think that working with, a therapist or a coach or somebody who specializes in this work can feel really supportive, so that you don't feel
Mm-hmm.
like you're alone as you're
Mm-hmm.
navigating those things.
Right. Right. And I was also thinking about how, I can ricochet, like at the beginning of a relationship, I could definitely ricochet between that avoidant and anxious. And I don't know if it's would be considered disorganized, but that like within like a couple of weeks span,
Yes.
right? The intensity of like, being anxious because you don't know what this other person feels about you, but then you feel like they're being avoidant. So like that kicks you into avoidant too.
So much of it is like self-protective, right? I mean,
Right.
even as you're describing it, I'm hearing that so clearly.
Yeah.
That feeling of like, I really want to know what's going on. And
Yeah.
since I can't understand what's happening with them, I'm assuming
Yes.
the worst, right?
Yep.
Which is that
Yep.
maybe they're not interested in me. And so I need to pull back to
Mm.
protect myself. And that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what this work is, right? It's really
Mm-hmm.
naming those things out loud and saying, oh, I'm seeing what's happening here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm gaining insight into what my
Mm-hmm.
patterning is.
Yeah.
And
And
I can
not just believing that it's truth. That, yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
because our patterning shapes our beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And our early attachment styles shape our beliefs about
Mm-hmm.
who we are in the world and how safe we are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how we
Mm-hmm.
feel about ourselves. So we have to be able to dig into that and recognize when it's an old pattern
Yeah.
versus when it's the reality of our current situation.
Right, right. Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I could see how this work. I mean, it's interesting because I'm actually working on some attachment stuff with my therapist, who's more somatic therapy, related, but like it sometimes feels like the work can be never ending, right?
It does feel that way. Yes,
And,
but like
yeah.
every step we take makes a difference.
Yes, yes. And I want to qualify what I just said with, the same thing is true with hormones. Like, I mean, people were like, "Oh my God, it feels like it's never ending." And it's like, well, because it is a journey. Like all of this is a journey. It's not meant to just be like, "Okay, I did my work. I'm done. Everything's all good." It's just like this is what we're called to do to really grow in our lives, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, can you tell me a few ways that attachment style actually can impact our health?
For sure. So I think some of the things we've touched on a little bit and they're worth expanding on.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of those ways really has to do with stress,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and I
Yes.
want to name this too, because you just mentioned somatic therapy. And
Mhm,
so much of this work, I think when it's done really well,
mhm,
it involves our bodies, it
mm,
involves our physical cues, right? Like we really need to be tapped in to what is happening internally so that we can understand how to respond appropriately in the moment.
mhm, mhm.
So stress is a huge factor when it comes to
Yeah.
our health, and being able to recognize the emotional triggers that arise and then what happens to us physically is a
Yes.
really important thing.
Absolutely.
And regardless of what your attachment style is, you're going to experience stress, but some of us internalize the stress and
Yeah.
some of us externalize the stress, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so that's really something to pay attention to and notice. And I think especially for people who have the anxious style, you might feel that stress more acutely. You might be
Yeah.
able to recognize it more acutely. But people who have the anxious style, or I'm sorry, the avoidant style also have stress, right? They're just
Mhm.
managing it differently.
Differently, yeah.
And
Maybe
that
pushing it down a little bit
is pushing
more.
it down. That's
Yeah,
exactly right. Whereas
yeah.
people with anxious style tend to really amplify
Mhm.
those feelings of stress, and that can make it feel even worse,
Yeah,
right? But it's like that's what we need to do to get the care that we deserve to have, right? Or the recognition that we need in our
right.
relationships. So yeah, so the stress piece I think is really, really big.
Yeah. And I just to sort of add on to that, I talk a lot on the podcast and other places about the HPA axis, which is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, right? And how much that impacts our hypothalamus pituitary and ovarian axis, which if you're talking sex hormones, we're talking about, for women, we're talking about the HPO axis. And really, so much of what impacts both of these is how our brain views a situation. And that stressful situation that kicks off this whole cascade and feedback loop of, specifically like high cortisol, if you are in that sort of anxious stress state a lot of the time, right? Which has a whole cascade of effects from our immune system to shutting down our sex hormones. And then eventually, and I can speak from personal experience of, not just from my attachment styles, but from the combination of all the things that eventually that cortisol will kind of plummet down because of that feedback loop. And I'm glad that you brought that up because, and this is kind of what I was referring to in the beginning, is we often think about, okay, my work stress, or even just like my kids driving me crazy stress, or my partner, like whatever, but we don't think about this sort of like underlying, and a lot of times I'll just refer to it as trauma because that's kind of overarching, right? But within that realm, there are all of these things like attachment styles that are kicking us off to how we sort of act and react in life, And so like I can think of one client in particular, like she's been doing all the things right, quote unquote, with the diet and the supplements and this and that, but like getting underneath her stuff of that high anxiety, really is coming back to things like attachment style.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. And when you think about, gosh, I'm just trying to process everything you just said.
I just said a lot. I threw a lot at you.
Oh my, I love it though. I'm just like integrating it into everything that I know, and it's just so potent. But just thinking about how central relationships are to our lives, right? And how often, I mean, I think about in a day, how many times I can be activated, right? How many times my nervous system can be activated with stress in relationships, right? Just being a regular human person out in the world.
Right.
And
exactly.
So, and if we're not aware of what might be happening or what we need or how we can approach ourselves with kindness and compassion and care, then we're going to walk around being activated pretty often.
Yep.
Right. And our bodies feel that, and our bodies are registering that as, like a survival reaction. Like we need to be doing this to get ourselves through the world.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating too is, there's research that shows how we view a situation will trigger either cortisol or stress hormone, or if we see a situation, for example, as exciting instead of like stress inducing, then more DHEA, which is kind of our anti-aging hormone, and, our building back up hormone, while cortisol kind of breaks things down. So we'll release more DHEA. And this is where I think work like this is so important, right? Because so much, I talk about this actually in my hormone breakthrough blueprint. One of the sections is mindset, right? But I always say you can't really get to mindset until you work on the underlying things, traumas, etc. Right. And this is the work that you do. So this is for anybody that's like been in that program or is going to be in that program in the future. I kind of want to put a fine point on this because you have to do that work. You have to understand your patterns. You have to be able to see what's happening so you can consciously choose something different. And then mindset really comes into play, right? Because you're like, okay, I know this, so I can kind of switch this thing like in the process, right? Like from a true place, not from a like I'm trying to be overly positive place, because I don't believe just that I'm just going to be positive is going to work.
That's right. 100%. And so I think you're also speaking to something, in the attachment world, which is that when we start to really develop more of that earn secure attachment style, we recognize the disconnections that we have in relationships as opportunities to learn about ourselves, to learn about other people, to become even more secure, right? And to really be aware of what it is that's happening and be curious about it. Because when we're in that shutdown mode or that, really intense stress mode, we can't be curious. And curiosity is a really important aspect of secure attachment.
Absolutely. And I actually like that word better than excitement, because I think that can more easily maybe flip the script. You can't always be like, I'm excited this thing is happening, right? But if you are curious, that can sort of take on the same thing, right? And that can flip sort of what your hormones are doing at the same time. So I like that word. I'm going to use that one.
Yes, it's so good, because it's also just, as we're talking about, it's like naming what's going on, where you're able to say to yourself, what just happened there?
Yeah.
And you're able to say to your partner, for example, like, what just happened? I just noticed, I saw that you kind of pulled away from me when we were having the conversation, and I'm wondering what happened for you. Do you feel like you can speak to that? Right. Which is way different than, oh my gosh, you just pulled away from me. You always do this, it's a very different approach, and it matters.
Absolutely. And, I talk to women all the time about, okay, so you've got to figure out ways to get out of your sympathetic nervous system and into your parasympathetic nervous system. And, doing things like meditation and visualization, and all those are great, right? Take 5 to 10 minutes a day to do that. But the reality is that's not enough. You have to do this kind of deeper work if you really want to level out your nervous system, which, as we kind of, got to, is such a, there's so many components to hormones. Like, let me not just say, of course, that it's just about stress, but it's such a huge overriding aspect because of our evolution and how our body works. I always tell women, like, your body doesn't want you to get pregnant when you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, and whether you want to get pregnant or not, many women obviously don't want to be getting pregnant, but that is what a cycling woman's body wants to do, right? Have the safety to be able to do that. And when you don't feel safe, then that whole system can't work right, because it's like your body's like, we ain't got time for that. We got to keep it alive.
Right. Yeah, we can't devote our resources to that, right? And I think, it's the same kind of thing, where we recognize that when we're in a place where we're feeling unsafe in our emotional world, right? I'm not saying that we necessarily feel unsafe in our relationship, but if we don't feel safe enough to be able to communicate our needs, or we're not used to communicating our needs, or, whatever it is, it's going to interfere with us having the type of healthy connection that we want to have.
So I am wondering about, the kind of typical couple that you may see, some of the time, the anxious and avoidant. Can it be a struggle to get the avoidant to therapy?
Yes, it definitely can be at times. And I understand that, right? When you think about what therapy is and what that's going to look like for a person who has the avoidant style,
right?
We're talking so much about how we view things, right? It probably feels very terrifying.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. And so one of the things that I really focus on is helping the person who has more of that avoidant style to feel safe, right? And to recognize that, like, we are here to be curious. We're not here to make anybody do anything different. I'm not here to make you share your deepest, darkest, thoughts and secrets and everything else. It's like, I really focus on being a safe and secure person for both of the people in the relationship, right? And then we're working together on the relationship. We're not focusing so much on, well, you did this and you did this. It's more like, this is the challenge that's arising in the partnership. So let's work on the relationship. And I think that really, it can take the pressure off a little bit of anybody coming to therapy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I think that's what so many people are scared of, is like, I may be called out on this, this, and this. And if you're coming from this place of like, no, this is just the experience that I have because of my background, and this is an experience you have because of your background, then it's like that blame and shame game is not part of the process.
For sure. And I think too that it's worth naming that anybody who has any of the insecure attachment styles, right? The anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, we all have work to do,
Yeah.
right? So
Yep.
oftentimes, if I am seeing a couple who comes in where one partner is more anxious and one partner is more avoidant, the anxious partner is definitely going to be more vocal about what it is that's happening in the relationship. And that person, the anxious person, also has a lot of things that they can be working on
Sure.
to shift
100%.
how they're showing up in that dynamic. So I want to be clear about that like what we're doing in our work together is really bringing a sense of balance and safety and trust to the relationship so that both partners can feel like they can approach the other with that felt sense of safety in their bodies and in their nervous systems, because we all have work to do.
Absolutely. That is for sure. So earlier you mentioned something about cycles.
Yes. So one of the things I want to credit Sue Johnson, because she really talks about the relational cycles that happen and attachment cycling. And so she talks about, she has this framework, and if you pick up any of her books, you could probably even Google it. And she shows this this loop that happens, and it looks like an infinity symbol where one partner's on one side and the other partner is on the other side. And we see how in moments of disconnection, we're really sort of like triggering our deep wounding of each other, right? But on the surface, we're communicating something different. So it just kind of goes around and around and around, where we say something that's maybe not quite naming what's going on. And then our partner feels really bad about what we just said, but then they show up and they say or do something that's not quite the right thing. And that really hurts us. And so she's really naming how important it is, kind of like you were talking about, to get underneath the surface and understand what the argument or disconnection is really about. Not just what's happening on a surface level.
Yeah. Oh my God. That just makes so much sense to me, just in my own life, of times where, I've totally felt this way internally. And then what came out of my mouth was like almost the exact opposite.
Yes, exactly. And it's like, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us. And again, it's like those self-protective mechanisms coming through, and we're doing whatever we need to do to survive in that moment.
Right.
And so when we create a sense of safety and we're able to say, this is what's really going on with me. And our partner is able to receive that and say, wow, I'm so glad you told me.
Right.
I didn't know it was about this.
Right.
Instantly, the trajectory of that conversation is different.
Just changes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so amazed and so excited that you have written a book to help couples on this, because, and I can imagine even like some deep friendships could probably utilize this book too, right? Because it's like
family relationships,
right? All of those, relationships, all this stuff comes up in. So, where can people find your book?
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon for sure, and then you can also order it through your local bookstore, which love
we like
too. Yes, it's so good.
Yeah.
Those are the places that it's available, and I also just want to name that I have lots of resources on my website. I have virtual courses that are self-paced that are all about attachment styles, and some support bundles, which are downloadable mini workbooks that you can use for yourself and in your relationship, and lots of blog posts and information out there.
I love it. I love all this information that you're giving people. Are you going to take the book on a tour at all?
Oh my goodness, that would be a dream. It's not in the works right now, but that would be something I would so love to do.
Yes. I was like, take it around the country, especially to pockets of the country maybe that haven't heard so much about attachment theory. Right?
Oh my goodness, that would be so incredible. Yes.
Well, if anybody's listening out there that can like bring Elizabeth to your local bookstore, give her a little shout out.
I'm in for sure. Oh, I also want to name, I love Instagram. So if anybody out there is on Instagram, my handle is elizabeth.gillette. And I post lots and lots and lots about attachment theory and healthy relationships. And I love connecting with people there.
Nice. Perfect. I was going to ask if there was a social that you preferred over the others, so we'll get all of those links too in the notes so people can just hit it directly and follow you and reach out to you and buy the book for sure. Very excited for it. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Yeah, I loved it. All right, you guys, I will see you next time.